Well, it hadn't taken very long. I had been in town less than 2 months, and already the local Proud Boys had figured out who I was and that I was against their hateful goals. This was not in Cherry Hill, which I've just served for a year now, but it was a few years ago when I just arrived at another congregation in Texas for a short-term ministry. And toward the end of my second month serving there, I was invited to speak at a protest. There was a particularly virulently transphobic local political activist, for lack of a better word, who was speaking at an event inside the county courthouse, sadly. And a protest was being organized. I was invited to participate by a member of the congregation, a young trans woman who was an unstoppable force of a social justice warrior. And I arrived at the event to speak on the steps of the courthouse to find myself surrounded by two groups. Most immediately around me were the majority of the attendees of the protest, a local coalition of socialists, anarchists, and communists. Those groups actually worked together in this town, which rarely happens, who were forming a black bloc. They were all dressed in black and concealing their identities, who were surrounding me. And I knew that they were not armed with firearms, but that they did have some knives and clubs in their backpacks. And around them were the counter-protesters, who included people who were known to be members of the local Proud Boys chapter, I was told by a couple of the Black Bloc members, and who were indeed carrying semi-automatic rifles. I was surprised how safe I felt being surrounded by that Black Bloc, even though there were people with firearms not that far away. It was a tense stalemate, but one that held, with just a few nasty comments from both directions. And it was an opportunity at least to connect with other activists in the community and to know who my allies would be in some of the social justice work, and for them to know that there actually were people of faith who were on their side. It's a story that in some ways highlights what it can mean to be opposing the hateful rhetoric of those who would oppress, those who would marginalize, those who would demean others. And I've found myself since then frequently thinking of the story of another minister whose words you just heard. Reverend Dr. James Luther Adams had been a UU minister in the late 20s and early 30s when he was hired by Meadville Lombard, the Unitarian seminary in Chicago, offered a position to teach theology. And he took the job, but with one condition, that before he started, he could spend a year studying in Europe. He hoped to deepen his scholarship before taking up the professorship. Well, that year in Europe, mostly in Germany, was in 1935 and 36. And by then, of course, the Nazis had taken power in Germany, and their work to oppress Jews and squash political dissent was already far too advanced. Adams responded not by speaking at protests. It simply was not safe there for anyone to do that. But he joined an underground movement, a Christian church underground movement that was engaged in resistance efforts against the Nazis and their brand of fascism. It was called the Confessing Church. He actually took his film camera and we'll pause for a second. And just getting started. Now that the microphones are back, and hopefully we've not lost the folks online, He actually took his video camera or his film camera and filmed some of the activities of that group. He also met with members and leaders of the supposedly liberal German Christian church, only to discover that their engagement with Nazism ranged from complacency to vocal support. Let me repeat that. The so-called liberal religious people in 1930s Germany put up with the Nazis, and sometimes it would even cheerlead for them. It was the more theologically conservative, confessing church that worked against Nazi oppression. That contrast affected James Luther Adams profoundly. Here's how a UU historian, Alice Blair Wesley, described it. Adams returned to the United States more convinced than ever that the tendency of religious liberals to be theologically content with vague slogans and platitudes about open-mindedness could only render liberal churches irrelevant and impotent in the face of the world's evils. And he stated his convictions loudly and frequently. It would be hard to overstate the influence that James Luther Adams has had over Unitarianism and now Unitarian Universalism ever since. But here's the thing about Adams that's important for us today. Now, we religious liberals, do still take our share of criticisms for the vague open-mindedness that Adams decried, and occasionally those criticisms do have merit. But the legacy of Adams and his theological guidance has been an ongoing and a deep effort to bring our faith commitments into the social arena tangibly as Unitarian Universalists, opposing the forces of oppression and injustice that Nazis embodied then and other fascists like the Proud Boys still embody now. It's the inspiration of Adams and those following in his footsteps that empowers so many of us today, myself just one among many, to stand up to the Proud Boys, to stand up to these violently oppressive groups. So I'll now say two controversial things, because I'm visiting, and maybe I can get away with that. Though, in fairness, the first one may only be controversial among academic theologians, which is that it's no stretch to label James Luther Adams an anti-fascist theologian. But here's the second one. We Unitarian Universalists collectively, well, we fall short sometimes, but at our best, Unitarian Universalism is an emphatically anti-fascist faith. And a few years ago, I would have thought that statement was true, but anachronistic, outdated, irrelevant for our times. Sadly, we know better now. Fascism has returned. But let me be clear, because people use this word in so many different ways. And when I say fascism, I'm not speaking so much about a particular ideology, but more a broad political instinct. And I'm borrowing these words from the historian Robert Paxton. It's the instinct to, quote, reject any universal value other than the success of chosen peoples in a Darwinian struggle for primacy. And I find that broad definition is helpful in understanding the broad forces of oppression we find ourselves up against. Because that privileging of one's own chosen group and the oppression of others stands in direct opposition to our UU shared values of pluralism, of equity, of interdependence. Here in the U.S., of course, this movement, with its virulently racist and xenophobic rhetoric and violence, has focused on a militant white nationalism that was displayed with particular fervor almost 8 years ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. But the anti-fascist response was on display there as well. That day saw an unusual alliance, one which I found myself immersed in 5 years later, of armed anarchists offering mutual aid to nonviolent faith leaders. And one of the faith leaders was our own Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, who at the time was newly elected as president of the National Unitarian Universalist Association. She explained it this way. When dozens and dozens of white supremacists came marching down the streets, chanting and yelling with shields and helmets, wooden clubs and sticks, coming right at faith leaders and peaceful protesters, anti-fascist groups stepped forward to protect the faith leaders. I know there is some consternation over anti-fascist activism, commonly known as Antifa. For myself, I give thanks that these Antifa activists were willing to step into the breach to protect my UU colleagues and other faith leaders, even if they had to do so violently. So please understand that when I call Unitarian Universalism a thoroughly anti-fascist faith, I am not making any comment for or against violent demonstration. And it's certainly true that our shared values do guide us to a broad-mindedness on matters of belief, but they do not lead us. They do not lead us to open our minds so wide that all of our convictions fall out. Because while there is no list of banned beliefs for UUs, our values guide us to work against those beliefs, those forces in society that themselves work to deny inherent worthiness, equity, justice. But as people of faith, what does it mean for us to be guided to be called to engage this work? In other words, what does it mean to be a prophet? And that term might surprise you. Popular culture calls a prophet a fortune teller, someone with a mystical claim to knowledge of the future, reading palms, tarot card readings, etc. But that's not quite the role played by the ancient Jewish prophets, Isaiah, Amos, Micah. Yes, they claimed divine insight, but rather than dictating holy edicts down to the world, they understood God to be inspiring them to read the signs of their times in the light of these divine insights. They were not so much divining the future as they were naming the likely negative consequences of present-day behavior unless the people changed their ways and resumed living by what they understood as their covenant with God. James Luther Adams took this understanding of being a prophet and drew it out to its logical conclusion that all of us are called to be prophetic, that all of us, in his words, are called to read the signs of the times in light of our faith. Which begs the question what it might mean for us today to be prophets. And I'm really appreciative how one of my colleagues put it, and it occurs to me there's a chance a few of you may know the person I'm about to quote, Reverend Peter Friedrichs. Actually, until just a few years ago, served one of the relatively nearby congregations in Delaware County, PA, in media. He put it this way: the role of the prophet, be that an individual or a community of faith, is threefold: to name injustice, to proclaim a hoped-for future, and then to go out, get our hands dirty, and work, making sure it comes to pass. Naming injustice, proclaiming beloved community, and working to bring beloved community to pass. That's what it means to be a prophetic individual, and it's what it means to be a prophetic congregation. In our context, given the signs that our times have been giving us recently, some of the many things this includes for so many of us Unitarian Universalists includes the struggle against white supremacy and the struggle for reproductive and gender justice. When it comes to white supremacy, there is power in naming this systemic injustice and identifying where and how it is subtly present in our own midst as well as in the larger culture. Indeed, there has been great work done in recent years. The report Widening the Circle of Concern that came out from the UUA 5 years ago unpacks this in great detail. And there is a local history. I was studying recently about some of the history of white supremacy, including the activities of the Ku Klux Klan, both in eastern Maryland and in South Jersey. This is not a faraway phenomenon. It's not just Birmingham, Alabama, where these things have happened over time. But after naming this systemic injustice, It's important also to proclaim an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, multicultural vision for the future, to make clear the future that we are hoping for and what is good and right about it, and then doing that work, sometimes the hard and subtle work of rooting out our own white supremacy, because we can then be more effective at rooting it out elsewhere, among many other reasons. But there are also more specific governmental injustices. We think of the rollbacks to reproductive justice in recent years after the Dobbs case, particularly at the Supreme Court. And we think of the bitter oppression that so many of our trans beloveds are experiencing. Naming the systemic injustices of patriarchy and transphobia that underlie these forms of oppression is an important first step, because it can then lead us to contrast it with a proclaimed vision of reproductive justice, of gender justice. At the congregation I serve in Cherry Hill, this manifests for us because of the fact that we are literally across the street from what I believe is the only abortion clinic in South Jersey. And it has been heartening. It was heartening to arrive and learn that already for many years, many of the members of the congregation were acting as volunteer escorts there, helping bring people in and avoid, or at least have the harassment minimized by the protesters out on the street that I drive by all the time. And for our trans and non-binary friends and neighbors and loved ones, there are groups such as the Pink Haven Coalition that are supporting helping people find more peaceful places to live, that are helping provide tools for folks to move from particularly oppressive places, like my former home state of Texas, to places where there is more justice, like Delaware and New Jersey. And so we can support these groups while also working to halt and to roll back unjust laws and rulings, etc., or to support better laws. It's a real treat to be in places like Delaware and New Jersey where we're not just pushing against the tide, we're pushing the good things forward when we go to speak to the legislature. Unlike a couple of years ago when I went down to Austin during its legislative session to support rather to oppose even more unjust anti-trans laws, but in my new home state of New Jersey to advocate for laws that reinforce justice for the immigrant community. All of this gives us a set of opportunities to consider that broader question. What will we do? How loud will we be? You will soon be working with a new minister, Reverend Christine Lunsford, who I've met on a couple of occasions and who I strongly suspect is going to be sharing many of these concerns. And it's an opportunity for you to be thinking in new ways about what you as a congregation can be doing. And it's a reminder to us as well that we are part of a living tradition, yes, but a tradition with a long and deep heritage of finding the ways to speak out against oppression and injustice. And while the times change, the issues shift, the details change, and sadly some of them don't change enough or go back to previous issues that we had thought had been overcome. We still have new ways to consider moving our faith forward and to recognize that some of our old ways of fighting injustice may still be useful and some of them may be less so. How can we change with the times so that we can continue to be effective in our work against injustice? To put it in short, to conclude with these words from another colleague of mine, Reverend Cecilia Kingman, how can we indeed, quote, allow our religious tradition to continue to be transformed into a liberatory and liberation-seeking faith. This is the call that I'm heartened, that I feel called to, and I hear so many of us Unitarian Universalists called to. I'm heartened by the words and the work of people like James Luther Adams, and like my colleagues Peter Friedrichs and Cecilia Kingman, and like that young trans woman in Texas who was so willing to take a stand, even to put herself at risk, to support her community and others seeking greater justice. It's probably best of all the reminder that in this work, as isolating as it occasionally can feel, we are not alone. And in that spirit and with that inspiration, may we continue going forward in this work in ever new ways. So may it be for us all.